And he said, I don't know if I can do this for 10 more years. And I said, what do you think you might want to do? I'm thinking about seeing if Bob wants an intern.
Today on Time we discuss, I have Kimberly Ward with me. Kimberly, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, I am super excited. You are not only a writer, but also an oyster farmer, which I am just blown away by. I am super excited. Obviously, we need to get the oyster somehow. Never occurred to me how that happened, so I'm super excited to hear about this. So let's start with this. A typical day as an oyster farmer, what is that like?
As an oyster farmer, my husband and I own a company called Mattapoisett Oysters. And we started this about 7 years ago. We came back we lived on our sailboat for 2 years. And when we came back, both of us had been technical consultants. And we came back, and after spending 2 years living on a boat with our daughter, technical consulting just did not fit. My husband went back and started traveling the week after we got back in our house. And he came home and he said, I don't think I can do this for 10 years. We had planned on doing that while our daughter was junior high, high school, and college. And so we said, all right, plan B. What's plan B? And I said, I've always wanted to write. What is it you want to do? And so I started writing about the time we had taken living on the boat. And he said, I really want to just be outside and on the water. And so that is how oyster farming was born. So in Massachusetts, the towns regulate the oyster world. And it's called grants. Obviously, the water belongs to everyone. The land that abuts the water is owned by whomever owns that land. But the water belongs to everyone. And so each town grants you access for shellfish growing and what's called aquaculture. And it is, interestingly, even growing oysters, the very same task is different depending on where you are in the water. For example, we have another grower in town. There are a couple of us, there are 3 of us in town, and another grower in town, and he's in very shallow water. And so he does all of his work on his farm at low tide. We are around the corner. We're in a little deeper water. So we get into a little skiff, little 19-foot Carolina skiff, and our commute is about, 6 minutes on the water into the very next cove. And we are most concerned with going out when there's very little wind, because the prevailing winds where we are blow southwest. And so we are interested in very little wind so we don't get bounced around. We have what's called a floating oyster farm. We have 5 lines. And so think of those as like your master line, and each one of them are anchored into the ground, the seabed, with what amounts to a great big giant screw. And each line has anywhere from 40 to 60 cages that float on these lines, and they're tethered with bridles. So the cage is attached at 2 spots onto the line. So if you can think of one line with 40 to 50 or 40 to 60 cages on it, and then the next line and the next line and the next line. So that's where our oysters grow. So they're floating. The top of the water column is where most of the food is. So it's not like having farm animals where you have to provide hay and grain and water. Our oysters are simply in these cages, and the food floats by. And so they eat what's in the water. You probably noticed, if you've ever had oysters, every oyster tastes a little bit different depending on where it was grown. And the reason it tastes different is it's different food, different salinity levels in the water. And so each oyster is a flavor that's based on what it has taken in as food throughout its lifetime.
That is so fascinating. Okay,
Love
so
talking with people who've never ever seen it, or I live on the coast of Massachusetts, and so it's not a brand new concept. But I realize probably to 99% of the world, growing oysters is probably a brand new concept.
yeah, it's funny, here I am talking about, look, oh, you're going a boat, you're casting a line, and here you're growing them.
So we buy seed, and just for context, our littlest seed that we buy is about the size and consistency of a red pepper flake. And so 200,000 oysters can fit in a little 2 cup glass Pyrex. And so we may start with a teaspoon worth of oysters, which is, about 250 oysters in a bag, and letting them grow from there.
How often do you have to empty the cages? How long does it take for them to grow?
It takes them anywhere from 2 months to 2 years. Sometimes, depending, you can buy seed in varying sizes. So you can start out from that little itty bitty one to, a half an inch, 3/4 of an inch, quarter an inch. Of course, it's more money the bigger the seed is, because the company that's growing the seed has to spend more time with it. But the benefit for us is that it gets to market.
A typical day, well, use that term very loosely, but because it takes them so long to grow, is there much maintenance involved on your end, or not really? Just
They
sit
are
back and
very high maintenance, these little bivalves. They're very high maintenance. So think about something in the water. Have you ever been on a boat or seen boats, and like the amount of growth that happens on a boat that's in the water? So you've got all kinds of things that are competing to grow in your cages. And our cages are they're relatively immobile. They're floating around in the water, but they're, in the same location. And so you get algae, you get stunning variety of, I consider it artwork sometimes, the types of algae and growth that comes on there, because the patterns and colors are pretty phenomenal. One of the tasks is that you take those cages and you flip them up. So you take the float, and you flip them up, and obviously we're going to try and pick a super dry, sunny day and let the sun kind of bake off all those things. It won't kill the oysters in a short period of time, but it will kill all the growth. And so one of the tasks is that we're flipping the cages. Another task is we do a lot of mundane sorting. For starters, if you have like that little 1 teaspoon, that's about 250 oysters. Well, they grow pretty quickly. And so soon enough, they're an inch and a half. They're taking up more space in the bag. So we want to separate them out so they have more room to grow. Oysters want to be with like size. Sure. So if you have a 1-inch oyster and a 2-inch oyster, that 2-inch oyster will compete the 1-inch one for food. And so we do a lot of sorting for size. We do a lot of sorting to keep the bags even. We clean those bags. So every time we pull those out, there's a station over on the other side of our property that's pretty smelly, because we clean the bags with a power washer and repairing equipment.
when you're doing your typical, again, I'm using that term very loosely, the typical daily chore, I'm going to say, with these oysters, is this pretty much every day you're out there, every day for 8 hours, every other day for 4 hours? What's the time commitment kind of like for this?
I have to say, even though we're a woman-owned company, so I am considered the owner of Mattapoisett Oysters. I have to say that my operations manager is my husband, and so this is a full-time job for him. It is a part-time job for me. So I am out. I commit to 2 days a week, and I just have to say I'm not as tough as he is. So I am generally out there 4 to 6 hours. For me, is a full day. He is out there 4 to 5 days, 8 hours. So it is a full-time job. We had kind of hoped it would be a little less than a full-time job, but it's really proving to be a full-time job. One of the other components, obviously, that I hadn't brought up is we sell. And so the idea that we have to go out to the farm, which is just a short commute by boat, that you go down to the marina, hop on the boat, go out to the farm, count out the oysters are sold in 100-count bags, and we actually sell two different sizes. So we sell what are called petites, and those are at about 2.5 inches, anywhere from 2.5 to 3 inches, and then what's called a select or a market, and those are 3+ inches. And generally they're 3, but less than 4 if you think about like a half shell bladder. And so we go out, put them into those 100-count bags, different regulations at different times of the year. They have to be iced. Right now, when in the hot months, we have to have the oysters from the time they're out of the water until the time they're on ice. It has to be less than 2 hours. We drive either to New Bedford, which is a 5-mile drive, or over to Marion. We have 2 different vendors that we sell to. And so the whole process is about a 4-hour round trip.
Right now, we're recording this in the summer. This episode isn't going to go live until November. So how is that going to work the time of year as it gets colder? Is this something that you only do 3/4 of the year, and then you harvest what you can and freeze what you can, or you just sell all of it during the summer and fall and then wait for spring? What's that component like?
You, as an aquaculture oyster farmer, you can grow and harvest 12 months out of the year. We have chosen, we are now empty nesters. We have the daughter that was 10 when we got on our boat 10 years ago is now going into her 3rd year of university. And so we're empty nesters, and we have chosen to do this as a 9-month venture. So we get on our boat and go to the Bahamas for 3 months.
I'm jealous. I'm not going to lie. I'm jealous.
Well, I'll let you know how it works. We've done 1 year in a row, and we'll see if we can make 2. Like sometimes gets in the way, but we come back in April. I'll take you, I guess, through a 9-month cycle. So in April, when we come back, what we have done is those pages that have been floating on the surface, the floats have a cap on them. So we unscrew as we're putting everything to bed, we unscrew those caps, fill those floats with water, and sink the oysters to the bottom. When the water temperature dips below about 50 degrees, there's not enough food in the water, and they go into, it's not called a dormant state, and I really need to know what the name is, but it's best to think of it as, like a hibernating bear. They don't need food, they don't grow, some die, most of them don't die. And they just sink to the bottom, and it's basically a dormant period. So we do that right around the holidays. So when we come back, we raise all those cages in, empty the water out, put the caps back on, get them all floating, hopefully nice and tidy again. And as soon as the water starts to warm up in the spring, it goes, it'll go from 50, 55, 60. Things are starting to grow, and there's enough food in the water. And then there's kind of a heyday of growing between about mid-May, so about now. And then the water will get lovely and warm. Everyone wants to go swimming, all that fabulous stuff. The oysters kind of stop growing because they are in a reproductive cycle. And so you may have heard the old adage, only eat oysters in months that end in an R. They actually taste better. You can eat them year round because, like I said, we're required to put them on ice, and they, we figured out with modern worlds how to make them safe. They actually taste better in September, October, November, December. They're done with their big growth spurt, and they're done with their reproductive cycle. And so now they're starting to hold on to that glucose and everything else, and they're really sweeter. So
that is so fascinating. I love that. Oh, man.
And like a giant science project is learning like something new every day.
So let's hang on the learning for a second. How did you actually get started from a learning perspective? How did you, and I know you said this is primarily started with your husband when you do this, you were more of the writer, but how's it decided, you know what, yes, let's become oyster farmers and then learn how to do it? Is this something that he already had experience with, or how did that unfold?
No, not at all. We have a neighbor and friend who he lives on the same cove where we live. So we call ourselves marsh neighbors, or some people that we can see and get to their house very quickly by walking across the marsh, and it may be a 7 or 8 minute drive if we're going there to car. But we have a marsh neighbor who has grown oysters, and we've kind of all been fascinated with it, and we always pepper him with questions, and so we've watched that for years, and we've talked to him. And when we came back from sailing, the very first week after my husband got back, and he went back to technical consulting, he was on a project out in Ohio, and so here he is with long pants and shoes all day under fluorescent light, sitting in front of a computer in Ohio, the middle of the landlocked world. And he came back after his first week and he said, I don't know if I can do this for 10 more years. And I said, what do you think you might want to do? And we were out walking on the marsh. We have a coon hound, and so we take her out running there a lot. And we were out on the marsh, and he kind of looked over at our neighbor's land. He said, I'm thinking about seeing if Bob wants an intern this fall. I was like, go for it. So he learned an awful lot from our friend and neighbor who is also in the business. However, right down in Rhode Island is a university called Roger Williams University, and they have an aquaculture course. And believe it or not, I know I never knew these things existed. So my husband took the course, and basically you learn, what are the regs you have to follow? What are the, it's really from a governmental response point of view, teaches you all the things you're going to get in trouble for if you don't do. I mean, obviously we have no interest in any one of our customers that are getting sick. Very bad for business. And but so there are an awful lot of rules and regs that come into play. But then you also, one of the other units that he had was going through all the diseases. We've laughed and said that we've learned how to massacre thousands of oysters in the last 8 years. And so you learn about diseases. Some of them you can do some things like having those clean bags that we talked about, getting all the growth off. You're going to get less mortality if you keep the bags clean and keep the growth off of them and keep the food flowing. And if you keep the oysters at the same size and in a pretty consistent density in the bags. And so, you learn a lot about how to avoid mortality.
Last question for you about the oyster farming before we move on to you as a writer. Aside from the financial investment, because I know you talked about having a boat and the cages and all the hardware, aside from the financial investment and the education, because it seems like that's not too difficult either. You just got to, find the right people or a course or online or something like that. What is the biggest barrier to entry in your opinion?
Oh, I'm going to say courage. It is an adventure in how do we keep these bivalves alive? And so there are all kinds of ways to fail. And so just having the courage to have each one of those be a lesson rather than a nail in the coffin.
I love that. I love the perspective, that insight. So the whole occupation of it is just fascinating. I'm blown away by it. That is awesome. And if you ever seen any of my other episodes, I always talk about these ones where I've never heard of them before. I'm just blown away. I love them. That's awesome.
I can imagine that learning about different careers that you never knew even existed is kind of a fun part of your podcast world.
It is. It is. It brings me so much joy. So, Kimberly, let's talk about you as a writer. How did you get started as a writer and get published? What was that initial that path like?
When we came back, I finally felt like I had a story to tell. I had, taken my family. The only thing missing pretty much was the minivan and travel soccer. We were, pretty much suburbia USA. And our daughter was 8 years old when we made the decision, and we walked away from conventional life and went and lived on our boat and sailed from Massachusetts all the way down through the Eastern Caribbean to Grenada. and waited out hurricane season, then turned around and came back. And 2 full years of living on the boat. It's an exercise in self-sufficiency. Um, and I finally felt like I had a story to tell. Now, what I've learned is that everyone has a story to tell. Even those of us who think that we're pretty boring and mundane, we all have stories. And so I never discount another person's story. But I came back and I started writing, and I had started in a memoir writer's course about the same time that my husband had gone back to work. And I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to publish a book. I don't know what it will look like. I'm not sure what it'll be, but I want to write a book. And so when he went off to go back to consulting, my daughter went to junior high, and I decided I was going to write a book. And so I started this course. And so it was the first time I had ever read my work out loud. And interestingly, from that memoir writer's course, my first 3 chapters are loosely based on the 4 essays that I wrote during that course. And I just kept writing. Early on, decided that I was going to self-publish. And so I started learning, for me, it was, again, like how I go out and get that education. An awful lot of resources out there. I was pretty confident in my writing skills. I was not at all confident in my editing. I didn't really know what the market looked like. I started reading a lot of memoirs. I started reading about memoir. I really wasn't sure what genre I was in. And once I was identified as travel memoir, I'm like, okay, I have something to look at. And, I could go off, I could read other people who'd written in that same space and learn a lot from them. I knew I needed some help editing. I knew I needed help with formatting. And I knew I didn't know the first thing about designing a cover. And so I just did the things I knew how to do, and I hired out the rest and learned as I went. And it's really not very hard to publish a book. Write a book is hard. But like the actual act of publishing it is not very hard. And then I've just taken pretty much, I think sometimes when you open yourself to the universe, that the universe provides. I had an incredible opportunity to launch my book at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. I have a friend who's the director of special events there, and she was infatuated with the idea. My book is called Crew of 3, and she loved the idea, and so she invited me to speak during a sailors series. The caveat was that I needed all of us on stage, including my then 19-year-old daughter. Okay. So I pleaded with her, and she was fabulous. So before she set off for university last year, which was her second year, so before she set off for her second year of school, I was able to do a talk at the sailors series at the Whaling Museum, and then we had a fantastic Q&A with the Crew of 3, and it was just a really fun event. And I feel like just since then, pretty much things have fallen in place. I will ask. People can always say no, but I will ask. And so I have done an awful lot of library talks. I have done some Barnes and Noble talk, which gives me a lot of street cred. I have done an awful lot of small venues. I did a walking book tour, which was a really unique thing to this area. And I had people traipsing through the trails and going to that spot where my husband said, I don't think I can do it. Then doors keep opening. I just got finished teaching a memoir writing course. And I'm like, okay, I'm still very much a student of memoir. I've written precisely one book in that genre. And however, I've learned some things, and I shared them with people who knew nothing, and getting other people to write. So I hope to continue that education. I have swirling around a book about reentry. So I've written about how did we leave for the trip. Well, contemplating what I will do for the trip itself. We sent postcards home to ourselves. We called them Love Us. And I was kind of surprised when I got home and we had over 300 postcards. So I have the trip chronicled in postcards, and I'm starting to post them on my website as a blog. Each postcard is a blog post called Love Us. And I don't know if there is something more in terms of writing there, if there's a book there. I don't know how that goes, but the whole reentry piece of what did we do when we came home, and here we came back to our very same lives as three wholly changed humans. There's no way you can live on a boat for 2 years and not come back changed. And in the cruising world, we call it reentry. Like going back to live on the land's life and all the things that are changed. And so I have swirling in my head a book called Shuckable, which talks about how we started the oyster farm, and and going through like all of these questions. I love it when new people come, and it's just a question after question after question. And I'd love to be able to walk through that whole process.
I spoke with another person, Steve Ganlon. At the time of this recording, his video went live a few weeks ago, and he's a visualization coach. And one thing that he said that I thought was really cool that stuck with me is that, and this goes back to what you're saying about everyone has their own story. But what he said was that, by interacting with people, you become part of their story. And so I immediately thought of that when you talked about everyone has, their story. You can't discount on anyone else's story. It's like, we're all part of each other's story, so to speak. And then again, when you're talking about the publishing process and marketing your book specifically, I was speaking with author Aaron Ryan, and he was talking about, we were talking about going through the traditional publishing or self-publishing, and we're talking about the marketing that goes with it. And he says, well, you know what, if the only thing that's holding you back from doing the self-publishing is the marketing, he's like, you're going to be doing that anyway. You're going to be talking about your book anyway. You should be excited about it. So it's neat to hear what you're saying, about the libraries and talking all these different engagements. That's really, and that you had the opportunity with you and your husband and your daughter. Really, really cool. Now, Kimberly, I am running a little bit short on time, but one thing I like to do is whenever I'm speaking with someone, I like to give them the opportunity to talk about a cause they believe in, a project they're working on, their business. So if you want to take another minute or two and discuss something of your choosing, the floor is yours.
Fabulous. Well, I will take the moment and let you know about the book that I published. It's called Crew of Three: How Bold Dreams and Detailed Plans Launched Our Family Sailing Adventure. And it is not a sailing, much to the chagrin of a number of people who think it is. It is a dream plan do book. I didn't know that I'm a gardener. I'm not even a sailor, and much less an oyster farmer. There are an awful lot of people who knew me in my youth who'd be laughing right now. First, that I lived on a boat for 2 years, and then that I get into fowlies and aprons and boots, and this is a very clean version of me. Kind of fun every once in a while to get clean and do my hair and put on a little lipstick. Whatever your story is now, y'all plot twist, learn about it, and go and make the changes. I'm a huge proponent right now of Mel Robbins' 5-second rule, and action is the name of the game. And so she started with 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Pick a something that's going to get you closer, whether it's a book to read or a website or a course. You can always learn about it. There are always people who know. Rarely are you forging, truly forging path through the wilderness that no one has done. Trust me, I'm sure there are people out there doing that, but there were other people who'd lived on boats before me with kids, and they'd homeschooled and, cooked on the boat and figured out laundry and figured out cleaning and all the different things on boats. And so I just learned from them. So you can always learn from people, and just take that next step, whatever it is. And like I said, with starting the oyster business, the biggest barrier is courage. That goes for all of us.
That is awesome. I love that. I love that perspective. Kimberly, it's been super awesome speaking with you today on Time We Discuss, where we learn what it's like to be not only an oyster farmer, but a writer as well.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. I really appreciate being here.